provides me with immense pleasure to have Partha Dasgupta, that is Sir Partha Dasgupta, here on today's episode of Dialogues for the Common Good. Thank you so much for being here. How are you today, Partha?
Fine, thank you. It's a pleasure to see you again.
I'd like to quickly take the opportunity to introduce Partha to the audience. Partha is the Frank Ramsey Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Partha has worked during his career on a variety of topics, mostly related to the economics of the environment, development, and population. I would say that one can rightly claim that his work on resource economics is the foundation for the way in which economists today approach the problem of resource extraction and its optimal use. His work on inclusive wealth, together with, for example, Kenneth Arrow, is the foundation of what governments are using to evaluate whether their countries are on a sustainable growth path or not. And Partha also extensively worked on the optimal population size. And I would say, Partha, you're only one of a handful of economists who dare to address that problem. Impressive. I think it is fair to say that Partha is one of the pioneers, if not the pioneer, of the nexus on environment, development, and economics. And he has influenced both our profession and policymaking to an extent that certainly few others have. Well, Partha, this by far does not cover all your contributions, but I hope it gives a first and right impression. Did I miss anything of importance?
You've said more than enough. Thank you very much.
So in addition to all of this, you have recently published, I would say, a groundbreaking report called The Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review. And this is a truly impressive work. And I really want to sincerely congratulate you for this, I mean, one can say monumental achievement. I hope and I think it does provide the right information and incentives so that environmental and resource economists and policymakers start to take biodiversity finally seriously. For our viewers who are not familiar with the report, could you maybe briefly state what you view as the main takeaway message of the report?
Well, thank you very much. It's very kind of you and very thoughtful and kind of you to make these remarks about the review. I'm grateful. First of all, I was asked to prepare a review of the economics of biodiversity, which didn't really exist as a subject, or at least not in a codified form. And I had no doubts in my mind that I would accept the invitation this was from the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the UK government in April 2019. I said yes immediately because I felt I was prepared for it. I'd been working on these related problems for about 40 years, 4 decades. But of course, I was looking at various strands, but each strand was the topic. So it's not as though I knew what the end game was and I was looking at strands. It wasn't like that. You choose a problem, say, for example, 2019, my Arrow lectures came out, were published, and it was about population in a declining biosphere, optimum population in declining biosphere. And that was about normative aspects of population. So although I wasn't targeting on what I'd been asked to produce, I knew I could do it, or I wanted to do it anyway. Okay, so that's the first thing. But pretty quickly, I realized that I wasn't going to write on the economics of biodiversity. Biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems. So what I realized was I was going to be writing the economics of the biosphere, the entire biosphere, about as all-encompassing subject that we social scientists can possibly tackle. So the units are the conceptual basis of the review, are ecosystems which are capital assets. They're durable, but of course subject to depreciation. If you mistreat it, an ecosystem deteriorates in quality, shape, size, you name it, depending on how you degraded. Land use change will convert a wetland into a highway, network of highways. Well, that of course transforms and degrades the wetland irretrievably. So once you do that, then you ask yourself, have I not got an asset management problem to study? And of course, that's exactly what it is. You've got natural capital, if you like. You can call it the biosphere natural capital. That's just a play on words, just to make it comparable to the kinds of assets we economists study. So what is biodiversity doing here? The problem with starting with biodiversity would have been that there is no unique way of thinking about biodiversity. We could be thinking in terms of biodiversity means the diversity of life. And you could look at it as species diversity. But on the other hand, if you're thinking of ecosystems as productive assets, which is what the review does, then what you're interested in is in the productivity of the assets and what makes for its productivity. So you ask yourself, what makes for a productive factory, which is going to be producing, let's say, shoes? Well, then you will be listing all the components that go into the manufacture of shoes, including, of course, the management structure. So that's what we should be looking at. And the question then arises as to what kind of diversity are we looking at, which makes a ecosystem productive. And that might be different from species diversity. It could be a particular combination of species and communities of species, and in the particular abiotic environment in which the ecosystem happens to be. So that's giving you the background to say that it's really about asset management. And the reason biodiversity, quote unquote, in its various guises is important is that there's a great deal of empirical evidence that biodiversity contributes to ecosystem productivity. And when I say productivity, I mean all the goods and services that the biosphere produces, which we make use of. Some of which we are observed, like agricultural fields producing wheat, rice, and so forth. Those are the tangible ones. But the ones which make the economics of biodiversity particularly interesting and difficult are all these hidden services on the basis of which we depend for our existence and then, of course, our well-being. I mean, nitrogen fixation, climate regulation, water purification, decomposition of waste. These are all happening all the time. And these are services without which our economies would collapse. Okay, so that's the first thing. And the second thing, and that'll be much shorter, briefer message, is that for a variety of reasons which you yourself know better than most people, Ingmar, there is a serious asset management problem that we face. If you just think in terms of markets, many of these assets don't have markets for a variety of reasons. Mobility is one reason. These processes have effects which have long-range transmission mechanisms, so that what happens here has consequences 5,000 miles away. You can't internalize that. And much of nature is anyway an open access resource, like the atmosphere is a sink for our pollution, the open seas, oceans, and so forth, okay? So we've got a massive public goods problem to handle as well, which is why, of course, the management of these assets, including assets like produced capital and human capital, has gone wrong. And so that's the second. And the third comes from the second, that because the prices or the cost that we face for using natural capital are far lower in many, many cases to their accounting prices, if you like. They're true, they're social, the social benefits they give. We have had a development trajectory over the past 200 years, accentuated over the past 70 years since the Second World War ended, in which produced capital and human capital have risen, accumulated at great length, massively, and have given rise to tremendous prosperity for the global economy. Of course, I'm not talking about there's poverty, but I mean, I'm talking about averages now. There's tremendous improvement, and we applaud it. We say we've never had it so good. But we've done that at the expense of natural capital, which has shrunk. And our monitoring system doesn't record that, because GDP doesn't record the depreciation of natural capital. So in a sense, we have been in a fool's paradise, because on the one hand, we have never had it so good. On the other hand, we are jeopardizing the future so badly that we have also never had it so bad, because we do care about the future, because our children and grandchildren are involved. So that's the first set of messages.
So I think that's really the reason why your report has been so influential already, because it gives you this unique view of looking at biodiversity or the biosphere as an asset, and that we are not pricing it right, that we need to do something about this. One thing I'm particularly wondering about is, for example, we have this target for climate change, right? We would like to have a maximum warming of, or safe warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I'm wondering whether there's something like that for biodiversity. So think about it. In the 1950s, around 65% of the world was wilderness. In 2021, we are now 35%. If these trends continue, then we'll have 25% wilderness left in 2040. In a sense, then shouldn't we ask the question as to what is the optimal level of biodiversity, or what is the optimal level of the biosphere?
Very good, very, very good question. And it's going to be impossible to answer very succinctly, but let me give you a whack. First part of your question, absolutely right. There's a single metric, there's a scalar measure, let's say concentration, carbon concentration, which has helped the economics of climate change enormously, because there is this thought that because of the non-linearities of the system, 1.5 may be approximately the area where you do not wish to go beyond, because it creates very serious difficulties. There's nothing like that in the economics of the biosphere. For the reason, as you can see immediately, the biosphere produces a huge number of services, not just climate regulation. And that's been one weakness of the received economics of climate change. It's been the weakness that lies in the fact that essentially, there are exceptions, but exceptions actually prove the rule here. That's the thrust of it, is that you bring in a climate model and graft it onto a mainstream model of growth and development, which has nothing to do with the biosphere. It has physical capital or manufactured capital and human capital at best. And then something called technological progress, which shifts the also points to the northeast in part one economics terminology, okay, between K and L. Yeah. And you can then do R&D, you can do investment in R&D and so forth. You can have the economics of technological change, showing how you can shift it to the optimal level because it costs and there are benefits and so forth. Onto that, you graft a climate model, and then you say, well, look, there is a byproduct of output, which is carbon emission. And that emission accumulates in the atmosphere, and you write down again, an accumulation equation of concentration, carbon concentration as a capital bad in this case, because we are now beyond perhaps where we should be in terms of concentration. And then you have a damage function. How much loss in welfare, either through output, indirectly through output reduction, or directly through on the utility function. And then you can do a Ramsey exercise. Mm. And if you do, you will get something like a shadow price of the atmosphere as a sink for your emission. which is the obverse of social cost of carbon. Okay, so that's pretty straight. Here we have more than one. We have just a huge number of services. I've already enumerated a few. But the corresponding thing to the 1.5 is the following. When I say that we have been running down natural capital, huge convergence, if you like, of findings in the earth sciences, in the ecological sciences, and some of a few publications from the economic sciences tell us that over the past 50, 60 years, literally that close, the demand we make on the biosphere in terms of what we absorb from its services, goods and services, exceeds the natural regenerative rate of the biosphere. So if you think of the biosphere as a renewable resource asset, which is what it is, you're basically diminishing its stock, if you want to put it that way. Okay? Now, the stock itself, of course, is very heterogeneous, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the point, the stock is heterogeneous, different types of ecosystems, let's say. Okay, there can be each different types of stocks. And of course, the services are multiple. Imagine, just for the sake of argument, that you had an accounting price for each of them, just for the argument. Then you can aggregate and think of it as an aggregate stock and an aggregate flow of output, which you are using up in your production side, we humans, and we're degrading the stock. Then the gap between aggregate demand for its services, biosphere services, and aggregates of the regenerative rate, that gap, the review calls the impact inequality. And that's the corresponding thing to your 1.5. Because you can't have that gap persist, because if you do, it persists because then the stock declines further and further and further, and of course you've got catastrophe lying, because it'll be on a barren earth. So you can't have that. So if sustainability means anything, if sustainable development means anything, it must as a minimum mean that we have to close the gap between demand and supply.
So I totally agree with that. And I think this is, I would say, the reason for which conservation is one of the key issues. But let's also think about this in terms of restoration.
Yes.
So conservation would be, well, to deal with this impact inequality, but restoration should add something in addition. I mean, the reason for restoration could be, on the one hand, could be conservation, yes, to help us with the impact inequality, but restoration also tells us something about the optimal level of the biosphere. So
I know both of them tell you, pointing to that, because conservation is the sort of a more passive element to restoration. Conservation says, lay off this wetland or this coastal fishery because it's damaged. Let it recover on its own. Okay. Now that's a costly thing because you're now not going to be doing things with it, but you are planning to do before. Like takes more material out of it. Okay. Restoration means, look, this is not only do we lay off, but we do something in addition to help it regenerate. Okay. So you're absolutely right there too, but it's the more active. The restoration is more the active version of conservation. Both of them have a cost in terms of foregone whatever else that we would otherwise do. So the closing the gap is now an imperative, just as in climate science you might say 1.5, keeping to that is an imperative. Don't let it go beyond that. Okay. Now, closing the gap means what? You're looking at the demand side in my left-hand side, if you like, in this hand. That is our total aggregate demand. And what we did was, what the review does is to decompose that demand in the way that Ehrlich and Holdren did in 1971, which I thought was very useful. We decompose it into total population, per capita GDP, and the efficiency with which we which our institutions and our existing technologies transform nature's goods and services, these that I already mentioned, into final products. Okay. Now that's one kind of decomposition. You can think of many other ways of doing the decomposition, but that's not what interests me at the moment. This particular one tells us that there are these three objects that that policies could be directed at in order to bring down the demand. One is future population and standard of living, if you like, waste and so forth, and the technologies and institutions that are on offer. That's part. On the right-hand side, you have the production function, if you like, the output of nature, the supply, the regenerative rate. Now, as I said, let's just for the sake of argument, imagine that we have accounting prices, so we have aggregates, so we're looking at scalar measures. If you can't do that, then you have a vector of inequalities. The impact inequality that I mentioned is not a scale, one inequality, a whole range of inequalities for each one for each of the services. One will be, one of them would be climate emission versus absorption of carbon in the atmosphere in a neutralized fashion. That'll be one. And then there'll be all the others that we have already enumerated. So let's stick, nevertheless, to the aggregate form for convenience of conversation. All right, then so you have got this in one inequality. So on the right-hand side is, of course, the productivity of the biosphere. And that's where your conservation and restoration comes in. You could help to raise the right-hand side to close, in order to close the gap. And you could do that either by improving the stock, which is what you're thinking of, or you could be thinking of trying to help make whatever stock you have more productive. So, for example, genetically modified crops is a way to enhance the productivity of your stock, whereas increasing the stock would be your increasing the size of the wilderness. So at one level, you're right. You're quite right that if you pose it that way, the next question arises, okay, so Partha, you're saying close the gap. Instead, we might say, well, we have the gap. Now let's do an optimization exercise and seeing how to face the gap. We know that the optimization exercise would say you'll have to close the gap at some time, because otherwise, you won't be optimizing, okay? So that's fine. But the date of closure will be an endogenous variable in an optimization, which is what you're asking. And you're absolutely right. We could proceed in that way. Why we didn't do it? I didn't do it in the review that way, although there are hints at it. In fact, if you look at the two star chapters, chapter 4 of the main review and chapter 13 star, you will see that I go exactly in the way you direct. But I stopped short and I kept it in a start chapter. So it's really for the graduates to take it further. And the reason is that we are far from being able to do anything like that. We don't have the data. We don't really know the production function. Think of it. We don't know how many species there are. When I say we, I mean those who know don't know, not you and me. We don't. Okay. They say, the best ecologists who work on this field, people like Peter Raven, Stuart Pym, Paul Ehrlich, they've written, continue to write papers on this, all right? And so what have they got? They're going to range from 8 million to over 20 million, possibly more than 20 million species of only organisms which have a cell in their, a nucleus in their cell, okay? And then countlessly more others, possibly bacteria and others, which don't have a nucleus. So when you got that kind of uncertainty, where you have such little knowledge of what goes on inside a forest, it's at this point, we don't have anything like a notion of a production function. Even if you had if you pretend that you can have the accounting prices. I realize, of course, the fact that you're thinking in terms of accounting prices means that you have something like an optimization exercise in the back of your mind, without saying, because optimum accounting prices come out of the optimization exercise, goes without saying. But I think one reason I keep on harping on closing the gap is for the similar reason to the one the climate scientists, not economists of climate change, but climate scientists have said, keep away from 1.5, beyond 1.5, because the models suggest that it's so nonlinear, there are zones of danger beyond 1.5, certainly more to, there may be a cascade of bifurcations and so forth. Okay, that's coming from the science, not from the economists. What we can do is to use the science to inform our economics. And because of that, they were saying maybe we should have quantity targets, like 1.5 or 2 or whatever. Okay, and hence, correspondingly, I'm saying we should concentrate on closing the gap. We are in such a second best world that that may be the right thing to do, because we have many, many things we can do even without optimizing, for example, improving our institutions. And that's why so much of the review is really about institutional reform.
Now, given that we know so little really about the biodiversity and the biosphere and how it feeds back into our economy, given that there's such a significant degree of uncertainty, isn't it then best to follow a most rapid approach path in order to close the gap?
That's, in effect, I didn't quite use the word most rapid. You're quite right. That's a very, very good point you've just now made. That in effect, I've been saying that because I said close the gap is the most urgent thing to do. Okay. And think of it this way. We're in a firefighting situation because so much of the evidence, I don't want no evidence which does not say that demand has been exceeding supply for about 30, 40, 50 years. It's, again, just bear in mind that earth scientists, many earth scientists today have proposed that we should regard approximately 1950, the period after the Second World War, immediately following the Second World War, as the point at which we entered the Anthropocene. We moved away from the Holocene. Okay? What do they mean by that? They mean that if you draw these time series of some of the biggest markers that describe the state of the Earth system, nitrogen, phosphorus, the deposits in ice cores and so forth. It's flat, pretty much flat up to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, rises slowly. And then about 1950 onwards, it rises at a fantastically fast rate. And this is mimicked in carbon concentration time series, as you know, that famous hockey stick in climate science. And it's replicated in GDP, global GDP. It's replicated in global population, in global GDP per capita also. Okay, so that's what's been happening. And so, yes, I think there is a very strong case for thinking in terms of pulling on the brakes. And it's a firefighting situation because the gap is huge now. Some estimates will be something like the ratio is something like 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 or so. The exact number is not important because these are extremely crude estimates. One reason they're very crude is very few people do this kind of work. Economists certainly haven't been doing it, just a few. And these have been in the United Nations Environment Program or the United Nations University. I've been involved with that work, but it's not really been academic people. It's been departments within UN organizations. So in a sense, we should be a bit embarrassed about that, we as a profession, because we should have been doing this. This is rich capital theory work, and the bedrock of growth and development economics, and we have been ignoring it. So it's like a firefighting situation. Now, if you're faced with a fire, a really large-scale fire, as we nowadays read about in Australia or in California or whatever in the summer months, what does a firefighter do? He doesn't optimize. He first wants to know the terrain so that he gets a broad picture of what needs attention, which is where you should head first. And then you do the detailed work of, how to manage that part of it, which is ways the wind is blowing and blah, 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 and all that sort of thing. So likewise, your intuition is exactly right. The time minimization problem, most rapid approach, insight, it's an intuition. that you put all your energy onto this problem now. It's an intuition, that's your intuition, and I think it's a correct intuition because of all these uncertainties. Yeah.
I like this analogy with a firefighter. And that, I think it brings us immediately to the accounting prices. So in your review, you were saying that these accounting prices, they're basically not reflected in the market prices, and that's a huge problem. So the accounting prices, they should reflect, let's say, nature's worth to society or our subject.
The common good.
Exactly. Now, given that we know so little about the biosphere, given that we face such a high uncertainty, given that we should follow a kind of most rapid approach path to close the gap, does this not more or less immediately imply that the accounting prices right now should be extremely high, if not close to infinity?
Extremely, absolutely right. But they are high. We don't have to worry about infinity. High enough will do the trick for you, and that's not a problem. But you put your finger exactly on the right button here, because the review spends a great deal of time thinking of alternative institutions, different types of institutional reforms that we need. Starting from the very local level of a village economy in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, up to the global level. Okay, we have covered the whole lot in the review. Why? Because of the heterogeneity of the biosphere, ecosystems differ across spatially, and their speeds are different. So you cannot think in terms of one set of institutions. There's a hugely rich literature in anthropology, particularly anthropology, and some in geography. And of course, economists have gone into it, but not the economists we know in the West. They don't do that. It's really up in South Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. I know their work extremely well. And I think I'm very proud of the fact that so many of the references in the review, which I use in the bulk of the chapters, come from, not from Western university publications, but publications from unknown universities in Asia and Africa and Latin America, because those papers studied local ecosystems, the way they've been managed, and the management structure, community management structures, differ enormously. Coastal fishery differs from a wetland management, from a mangrove to something else, okay? And for very good reasons. We have good reasons to understand these social norms of behavior, which guide the handling of these resources, because we economists know how to think about them in an ordered way. And I try and do that in the review. So it's there, and there, one of the real realizations is maybe the state ought to be far less involved in management of resources. They have actually contributed to the erosion of natural capital, local natural capital. There's tons of evidence of that, largely because they've interfered with social norms and have not been able to replace it with adequate governance structures that substitutes for the broken down social norms, largely because they haven't a clue. The government knows nothing about what's happening in the coastal fishery. It's the coastal fishermen who know, all right? And they had actually constructed norms of behavior of when to catch, where to catch, how to share the catch, and so forth. Now, so there's that at the local level. At the global level, you have these huge numbers of open access resources. Now, you don't need too much of any optimization to say that, well, the move should be to try and create prices or cost for exploiting them, bring in institutions for that. And one of the ideas that I had in the review was the creation of an international agency like the World Bank and the IMF, who are given the task to monitor and manage, and perhaps ideally charge for the use of the global commons. Now, That's the accounting prices, because the rents that they would be charging would be the accounting rents for the use of the open oceans, for example, for all the transportation that you're. And it's a terrific revenue generating source. In addition to, of course, simultaneously lifting the pressure on the oceans or the atmosphere as a sink for pollution. But we haven't gone that route. We are thinking in terms of, I haven't seen any serious proposal in COP15, which even thinks in terms of the management of the global commons. So the review has gone, instead of trying to estimate accounting prices, which would be an impossible thing just at the moment, what it does is to think of alternative institutional arrangements, which could start thinking about imposing such rents. They won't necessarily be optimal, but anything positive is better than zero. Or at least when I say anything positive, I don't mean infinitely high. I'm simply saying that and there's a lot there that one can do, yes. But they're all in line with what you're saying, by the way. One further point I'd like to make, which is one of the things that the review emphasizes, and something that I think we all should agree to, all economists should agree to, that these accounting prices have so much of normative feature built into them. I mean, so does market prices, by the way. If you accept market prices, you're already buying into a huge amount of normative structure. But accounting prices are more, if you like, overt, that people aren't going to agree necessarily on accounting prices. Think of, for example, the controversies over the social cost of carbon. You have a range from $10 a ton to $200 a ton. Why? Because the estimates differ, people are different, etc. Okay, but that shouldn't stop us from thinking of in terms of accounting prices, because just as it shouldn't stop us from debating political activities or public policies. We have difference of opinion, and we resolve it in a democracy through our votes. So I'm not worried about that. I still use the word common good. I think you're exactly right to think of the common good at this point rather than talk about social welfare. And that's because so much of the imperfection of the contemporary world is such that there are movements in which everybody can benefit, that we can talk about the common good. So let's stick to that here.
So I would like to get back, if we have time, to the institutions, because I think your proposition that you made there is absolutely vital. I'd like to very quickly get back to the accounting crisis, and there's a question by Professor Jasper Meyer from the University of Leipzig, who is also working on issues of biodiversity, and he said, he basically asks what needs to be scientifically done to systematically measure and implement accounting prices for biodiversity.
Well, there is a good deal of work already there. Some of them, there's a whole book, volume of essays that was produced by SANDI, the South Asian Network for Development and Environmental Economics. That was a Cambridge University Press publication. I think it came out in 2014 or 15. I can give you this, the references, which of course are for South Asia. What people tend to do is to study ecosystems and look at the productivity of ecosystems and see what it is bringing to the neighboring economy. Now, there are many ways of thinking about it. In some cases, at least in the United States, a lot of it was done through viewing ecosystems as amenities. So you look for willingness to pay. So you have questionnaires asking how much you're going to be willing to pay to clean up, say, the Pacific, the Chesapeake Bay, or clean up some dirt here or that, and so forth. So that's one kind of ways of trying to estimate. But that doesn't require knowledge of the productivity. It's how you think of birds populations or whatever. Okay. The reason the work that's been done in the volume that I cited just now is important is that it looks at the productivity of ecosystems. And there, let's say shrimps. You have shrimp cultivation, and that destroys mangroves. So the idea is, when you evaluate a shrimp farm, new investment in a shrimp farm, one of the cost items which is very often missed is the value of the mangroves forest which is being destroyed by that. So the question then shifted up, what does a mangrove forest do for the local community? And then one of them would be protection against floods and storms. Storms, let's say. And you can have estimates of the protection it offers. And you thereby try and estimate the accounting price. It's very much like a production function structure, and you look at the productivity of the capital asset and then see what it looks like.
So what I would say is this is the old way, or maybe, well, the standard way of calculating accounting prices.
Yeah.
But these are still, let's say, local accounting prices.
Yes.
They treat biodiversity or the biosphere as a local public good.
Yeah.
But in fact, what we would like to argue is that there is that it should be viewed in an international way, globally. Sure. We need to deal with the spillovers, and if biodiversity was only a local problem, as you write throughout the whole review, then countries could deal with that, or would deal with that by themselves. And
no, I don't agree with that, because there is a difference in power between rich countries which import primary products and there are bad governments out there. So
I do agree with that, but essentially the whole issue is also one where the extraction of local resources or extraction of the local biosphere spills over international. For example, when we talk about the Amazonas.
Sure.
And that is something that is not reflected in accounting prices.
Absolutely right. The analogy would be over climate, because yes, it is a global estimates. It's always looking at the global side of things. Yeah, you can do that. You can do that. It's a bit early days precisely because the production structure, production functions have not really been estimated. I mean, this is not that it can't be done. It's that we're really at the earliest stages of doing it. So we can also ask, I was previously talking about an international organization, that is the institution, which could in principle monitor and charge for the use of traffic, for traffic across the Pacific and the Atlantic, because that damages the ecosystem there. I mean, the oceans, okay? The oceans are in a bad way, fine. Now, the oceans are in a bad way for a variety of reasons. It's not just one. It's a bad way also because of all the pollution we are dumping through the river system, if nothing else. All the plastic that goes along and transfers itself. So there's that. Obviously, the oceans have to be modeled. And there are models of the ocean. And the global model of the oceans come out of these grids. You create a grid, large grids, of course, very coarse grids, and I've seen models of that sort. And then transportation that takes place across the grids of pollutants and water flows and so forth. Okay. Now, it is possible in principle. I don't see any intrinsic difficulty. And looking at the services that the oceans provide, climate regulation is one, extremely important. All right. Then, of course, transportation is another. The availability of transportation, and we ought to be looking at that too. You know, how much of trade takes place across it, and that benefits us. Without them, we wouldn't have it, and so forth. And of course, they compete because the excessive trade does dampen, brings in pollution as well, and as well as disturbing aquatic life. So you have to do it that way. There are rudimentary models that can be used now by economists, but that's the way to go. Again, you'll be looking at the oceans as a capital asset with the productivity producing multiple products, some of which compete against one another. That's the key thing. We should not be surprised by that, but I haven't seen any convincing model yet of it. That doesn't mean it can't be done. I think 5 years of work by a group of really bright economists, we should be able to start having sensible answers to these questions.
So you would say an important step in order to systematically measure accounting prices would be to really figure out the production functions.
Absolutely, for the reason that that's what they're supposed to be doing. It's, remember, accounting prices is the, if you like, the the common slope of indifference curves and isoquants, right? That's what we learned when we were studying. And basically, that's what they are. So yes, you do need to know the productivity. And you can start at the productivity base because that's where the action is. And then what you do is you see if the rate of return on investment, in this case, reducing the harm that you inflict on the oceans, is very high. Then you do that. And of course, the answer is going to be. Let me give you a cleaner answer in some ways. I'm so sorry, I should have, before going to the oceans. In chapter 2 of the review, you will find a box in which I do what I think is a really one of the best calculations I've done in recent years. In the ecological text, I found data on the total stock of primary producers. Primary producers are organisms that photosynthesize. Okay? And so they're the bedrock of all life. Everything else depends on them. So these will be plants, algae, and many bacteria. Okay? All right. So they have estimates of that. Only recently, the estimate was published about 2 years ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. The global stock of primary product producers. There's also estimates using similar techniques of the global production of biomass. Now, biomass is being produced by primary producers, remember? All right? So what does an economist do? I immediately, when I saw those two estimates, I divided one by the other. And that gives me the average return because it's the total output divided by the total stock. Do you know what the figure was? It was the numbers I had in front of me from the publication were 19% a year. Now, what's that mean? A year. Now, you compare that with the yield or own rate of return on physical capital, which is about approximately globally, it's about 4 to 5%. So you've got a huge difference. All right. Now, that doesn't mean anything on its own because you could say, oh, yes, well, of course, if it's an optimal asset management, then there will be a rate of return. This will say that there'll be a rate of return, there'll be a capital gains on physical capital of the order of 15% to make up the gap between the 20% and the 5%. Okay. If that happens, then we are indifferent between holding natural capital and physical capital. But of course, that can't be right because we know natural capital is declining relative to physical capital. That's the impact inequality that I began with. If that's the case, the capital gains ought to be just the reverse. Natural capital's price ought to be increasing relative to physical capital. So you've got a clean way of showing that we are in a massive allocation failure. We've got a huge rate of return there in primary producers. Now remember that 20% is a minimum because it's the average. We're not looking at the marginal. The marginal will be higher than the average. Okay. So that's the kind of thing that can be done even as we speak. So we now know that the shadow price will be much higher. Now we move in that direction. And we didn't build, the review doesn't build itself on primary producers. That would have been wrong because primary producers are the bedrock, but it's ecosystems in general. But it did give me the leverage to think in terms of rates of return on investment. Yeah.
I really like that box. So I just with a couple of numbers, you neatly showed the problem. That was really nice. Partha, let's talk a bit more about the institution. And I would link this to trade. And in the review, you very often point out that developed countries basically live off the resources of developing ones. And I mean, it's clear that this is not only, I mean, the reason for this is not only comparative advantage, Ricardian trade theory, no, but it's mainly because the developed countries are already above their own biocapacity, and the biocapacity at their home does not provide enough for all their consumption. So Is trade thus, in a sense, especially trade in natural resources, is it a key sign of overconsumption?
Very good question. Thank you very much for asking. I haven't quite put it that way, but the way you have put the question is exactly right. Yes, I think international trade, the way we have taught the citizen to think of trade and then look at the fruits, and then the fruits of it has been this growing of prosperity that just now mentioned earlier, previously, the last 70 years, huge prosperity throughout the world, reduction in extreme poverty and so forth and so on, all that. We tend to put it on trade, and a lot of it is on trade, yeah. And globalization has been the big song and dance over the past 40 years, flat Earth, and we applaud it and everything. It certainly has helped enormously in precisely those indicators which suggest we've been successful. We've never had it so good. But now let's look at we've never had it so bad side of it, which is, I think we teach trade very badly. I think textbooks are really misleading, and I think the World Trade Organization has been really very, I would say, naughty in not recognizing the missing markets really affect our conception of trade. The theory of comparative advantage and the gains from trade, that whole enterprise, that whole architecture is built on the idea of complete markets, complete and perfect markets. And, you know, that's pointless now. We wouldn't be discussing the economics of biodiversity if we had complete markets. So let's just throw that away and ask, where are the incompletenesses? And so that's what the review was doing, which is that it so happens that the tropics house the richest biodiversity. And when I say it so happens, there are very good reasons why they happen, because that's where the most productive temperature and the rainfall and so forth are conducive to having rich biodiversity. They also happen to be amongst the poorest countries. So the tendency of trade has been, through the Industrial Revolution, has been to use primary products from what were pure countries and for manufacturing goods and services. That's fine. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with it, and the review is not claiming that. Nor am I going through any exercise in political exploitation and so forth. I haven't gone that route. I'm simply asking, what happens to resource allocation if there is massive failure of pricing of the primary product? And I needn't now rehearse why there will be a massive underpricing of primary products, because of all the reasons we have discussed. These are ecosystems supplying goods and services which are producing the product which we then import and then transform into final goods, which brings us back to the impact inequality. Now, if they're underpriced, then there is a resource transfer from the poor countries to the importing countries. That's, straightforward examples. Deforestation. You cut down trees to supply timber, and the externalities associated with the reduction of tree coverage locally is not paid for, that destruction. And so therefore that exporting country is actually losing resources when it exports to the importing countries. So yes, this has been a huge, I think I haven't got major calculations showing how much of transfer has been taking place, because again, you have to then estimate those externalities, some of which have been done in the case of these exercises that I mentioned earlier in South Asia, where you're trying to figure out what the externalities amount to. In shrimp farming, that's very interesting, because again, there are these externalities which have actually been estimated. So if we look at that, we can work out how much of the underpricing is taking place when we consume cultivated shrimp, which we import from Sri Lanka, let us say, or wherever. So there are ways of doing it if we are patient and systematically work through the fact of missing markets in primary products. We can get a long way towards trying to understand the character of international trade. But this is not an argument against trade, by the way. It's just an argument in saying that let us not root for globalization without recognizing that opening up trade, freeing trade, has consequences which we forget.
Partha, I have so many more questions. I think we only went through half of these, but I know your time is limited. May I ask one more question?
Please. I'm sorry that we don't have time for going through all the questions in your mind, but I felt I want to give clear answers as opposed to trying and keep the clock to timing, because it's better to be clear as to what the drift of the arguments are.
Yeah, no. I really like that, and that's why I also went further and not just stopped at one question and then, yeah. All right. So my final question. So Partha, our time is basically over. Let's finish with a personal note from your side, if you allow. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of biodiversity and our biosphere?
I can't really answer that. I'm not built that way. I think I've been built, when I say built, from my education, from a parental background, to be somewhat dispassionate in studying. My father was described as being somebody who's had, if you like, acute compassion. But the acuteness is the important one, in some sense, which is that it wasn't sentimental. It was more that there is problems here which you need to study. I don't think a little bit much on this thing. And some days when I feel, things are happening, I say, gosh, yes, we're moving in the right direction. And then something happens else, which I see is going to counter it without any, and then I think that it's gone back. So I don't know. I don't know whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I don't think humanity is going down the tube in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 100 years even. We'll muddle along. And then, as usual, what will happen is the rich, those who are already ahead, will continue relative to those who aren't. That's sort of the iron law of economics. These things are cumulative, as it were. That'll be the case. I think we are likely to see more crises, ecological crises. They're growing in numbers in some sense. Now, it may be bias reporting. That could be. There's greater coverage today than it used to be before. So it could be that. I don't know. But there's no question. I take the impact inequality extremely seriously. And if I stare at it, I say, gosh, I should be pessimistic, because I don't see the firefighting mode in international relations at all. COP15, COP26 may move us in that direction. I don't know. If it does, then I'll start being optimistic somewhat. I can't do any better than that. I don't know whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. The other day, at a dialogue that I had with Lord Martin Rees, from one of the colleges here, St. John's College, my own college, we were asked the same question on a grade of 0 to 10. Where would you be in terms of optimism? 10 is highly optimistic, as it were. Okay. Martin gave the answer 5. And my answer was that I don't know, so I have a flat distribution between 0 and 10, which is, of course, 5. That's the expected value is 5. So that's the best I can do.
Do you have any last, let's say, thoughts for policymakers, last comments for policymakers or environmental economists?
I think for policymakers, there are policymakers and there are policymakers. The UK government takes natural capital very seriously. Their response was published on Monday, by the way, to the review. The government's response. It's on their website now. It was a very favorable one, a concerned one. and they pointed to the things that they're intending to do and the things that they are doing. On the other hand, you have nations, which is where development means is defined as increasing physical capital and human capital. Nature doesn't get a look in. I know that because I was involved in discussions over the years with at least one of the countries. So there are policymakers and there are policymakers. I would say at the moment that if I were advising really a poor country, primary product country, I would say lay off local communities, help them, but in responding to their demands for how you can help them. Do not pretend you know the local ecosystems as well as they do, because lives are matter and they're very poor. A lot of the distress migration can be traced to ecosystem collapses there. In rich countries, I would say, let's say the group of 7 which met, I would say, why aren't we discussing the ways of handling the global commons? And again, I come back then to these introducing international institutions rather than having bilateral agreements, because they don't mean much. So, for example, Norway says that it's paid for the protection of the Amazonia, and they've been disappointed with the outcome. Well, if there's no, if there's no way of ensuring compliance, what do you expect? It really does need an international effort on these things. But they don't require a review of the economics of biodiversity to tell us that. First year economics tells us that we have an open access resource. I mean, if it's global, what you need some institution to manage it. Otherwise, because nobody owns it. Since you say everybody owns it, means nobody owns it, and therefore it's open access. The tragedy of the commons. That metaphor continues.
Partha, it has always been a sincere pleasure to discuss with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, it's a pleasure as usual talking to you, Ingmar, and may there be many such occasions.
Partha, thank you so much.
Take care. Take care.